Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Mark Steiner. Great to have you all with us. A new report by the Political Economy Research Institute in Massachusetts tackles the complexity of the feminization of the labor force worldwide. Now, this study analyzed unpublished data sets looking at 125 countries over 50 years between 1966 and 2016. The report, Informality, Inequality, and Feminization of Labor, that these two gentlemen wrote, we're going to meet today, Adem, Elveren, and Ceyhun, Elgin, it shows that women participating in the labor force does not necessarily reduce income inequality everywhere, but the growth of the informal sector in the labor forces really increases income inequality, while kind of rising standards in poorer countries. So there's a lot of contradictions in this. Women's participation in the force, which we'll talk about here, is not often associated with increasing inequality. And we'll kind of examine that. And we are now joined by the two authors of the report who join us here at the Real News. And Adem, good to have you with us, and good to have you both with us. So let's begin. And Ceyhun, let me just start here with you, and let's kind of get an overview of this report and what it's really telling us. I mean, it seems to me that when we first think about this, that it doesn't kind of fit logically, that the feminization of the workforce should create equality everywhere, but that's not necessarily the case, correct?
Exactly. So the increasing female labor force participation rate is associated with lower income inequality if informal sector size is low. So in countries where the informal sector size is large, this negative correlation between higher female labor force participation rate and lower income inequality basically disappears. So we basically find in this report that informal sector size significantly interacts with the relationship between female labor force participation and income inequality. And female labor force participation rate is only beneficial for income inequality and reducing income inequality only if informal sector size is small.
So Adem, when you take that, I'm curious as how you spend a lot of time obviously talking about this informal workforce as opposed to the formal workforce, and women seem to be driven into the informal workforce no matter what kind of economy you have. So describe what you mean by an informal workforce and how that changes the dynamic.
Basically, they both contribute to GDP, economic growth, but in the case of informal economy, somehow employers they are not registered. That means they contribute, but they are not registered. So, and of course, in that sense, there's a substantial difference between advanced and low-income countries. So, in terms of the size and also in terms of the effect or in terms of the relationship between income inequality and the size of informal sector according to our findings.
So let me ask you a semi-naive, non-economist question here then. So how do you know that what you do is exacting in terms of what your results you find, if in fact, especially in the informal sector, a lot of that is not kind of followed by the statistical agencies in certain countries. So how do you account for that?
That's a very good question. It's actually in the case of studies that deals with informal sector, that's the key question because you never have the real actual data. That's one major problem, but I like to emphasize that what we are trying to measure is not inequality within the informal sector, but what we pay attention is the general, or I should say, overall income inequality. So that's important because we know that overall wages base, or I should say income, in the informal sector actually less than the one in the formal sector. So my point is that, maybe short answer to your question, yes, we cannot deal with that, but that doesn't actually create bias in terms of our findings.
So there's also, did you want to add anything to that, Ceyhun, before we move on?
Yeah, sure. So the issue is that also, these income inequality measures are mostly relying on labor force surveys as well as on household surveys where, the government statistical agencies try to collect data directly from households and they get data about their incomes, about households' incomes, and all these income sources are also both including formal and informal sector income to some extent. Therefore, the inequality measures that we have, of course, they don't perfectly capture informal sector income, but at least, we believe that they, to some extent, capture some of the income generated by the informal sector.
So, and you, in the report, you make the real distinction between core and peripheral economies, and economies
Sure.
of the periphery. So let's talk about what those mean. And I also really want to more clearly define the kind of work we're talking about that women seem to dominate in the informal sector. But let's start with the core and periphery. What are we talking about here? And how
Sure.
different is it?
What we mean by core and periphery, here we simply borrow the categorization of Wolstein in his word system theories. In that theory, accordingly, he argued about one world, like the one world production system, in which so-called there is international division of labor between like dominating capitalist countries and other countries. Basically, they are based on agriculture. So this international division of labor actually works in a way these peripheral countries provide raw materials to the core. And this is actually also very related with the informal sector, the type of the jobs as well. Because what we see in most of the low-income countries, these jobs are actually mostly performed by women because they are domestic workers, they are home-based workers, and women also perform as contributing family workers.
Well, what's the core difference, no pun intended here, the core difference between the informal sectors, whether they are in more developed countries or less developed countries? I mean, how are they defined differently?
They don't. Maybe Ceyhun can continue. They don't. They exist in both countries. But if you look at the ratio in general, the ratio, the size of informal sector is less in advanced countries, or let's call it in the core countries compared to the low-income countries.
Ceyhun, what were you about to say? I'm sorry.
Sure, yeah. So the issue is that generally the informal sector size is defined globally in the same way in most of the countries. However, in emerging markets, in less developed economies where the countries are having a lower level of GDP per capita, the poor countries, they have a much larger informal sector size, both in the labor market as percentage of employment, as well as percentage of value added. But however, this relationship between GDP per capita, or how rich a country is, and informal sector size is not directly linear. That is, there is also evidence towards the non-linearity of this relationship, which means throughout the course of development from a time series perspective for a particular country, or in a cross-sectional framework, in a cross-country framework, when informal sector size gets larger, when GDP per capita gets larger, informal sector size increases to some extent up to a threshold level of GDP per capita, and then starts to decrease after some threshold level of GDP per capita. So there is an inverted U relationship between informal sector size and GDP per capita, and that's also why the relationship between informal sector and income inequality is, according to the findings of our paper, is also different across developed economies and developing economies.
So let me pick up from there, Adem. I'm wondering if the way we defined the informal workers on the planet, so is it? It seems to me that from reading the report and looking at other reports, that the informal sector in the developing countries can almost form a huge factor in the economy of the country, just in terms of its size and number. And the informal workforce in the more developed countries in the West play a different role. And how does that affect the whole question of equality and inequality with men and women in the workplace?
First, I'd like to emphasize the part of the, I should say, feminization of labor in that context. It has different effects on income inequality because what we see is, if you look at advanced countries and paying attention to employed men, actually the share of employed men in informal sector is higher than compared to women. It is higher in advanced countries compared to low-income countries. So that's one key difference. And of course, this affects the income inequality in a different way because, as Ceyhun already mentioned, increase in female labor force participation rate actually reduces income inequality.
So when you used, explain to us, one of the keys you use here was the expected household income inequality as a key, right? Am I right about that?
Yes, that's right.
So what does that mean?
Yes, that's one of our key income inequality variable. It's called estimated household income. I think it's a novel approach to measuring inequality. It is actually computed by University of Texas Inequality Project. It's an informal research group led by James Galbraith. Of course, that reflects, as we mentioned, as we discussed, just focus on the formal sector. It is pay inequality in manufacturing sector. But what is good about this data set is, compared to other measured inequality data sets, it has the highest number of observations, which leads actually for this kind of studies, more robust results, because there are over 4,500,000 observations for a huge number of countries and also a very long time period.
Wow. I'm just, as you were speaking, I'm just imagining the kind of time and work the two of you put into this report. But if the data is based on like official statistical agencies from countries across the globe, developed and undeveloped, isn't there a risk that the data could be biased towards formal work, and informal jobs don't seem to, like domestic care or whatever they might be, are not often reported, taxes are not paid? So I mean, how does that alter the dynamic?
It's a very good question. Once again, what we are measuring is overall income inequality. But one key fact is the wage difference between formal sector and informal sector. So there is like formal sector wage premium. That means this is true for both developed and developing countries, that overall wage levels are less in informal sector by nature, because employer trying to take advantage of this. So regarding your question, that means we cannot include this in our study. But if you were able to include, actually, that will increase the income inequality even more. That means actually we are underestimating income inequality, and which means that actually if we were able to add to this our study somehow, if we were able to measure it, that will actually even, I think, stretch our results, to make our results more robust.
So let me finally ask you this one question about where this takes you. So you've done this report. I mean, it's fascinating. It's intense. But I'm curious, and we'll start with Ceyhun and let you finish up, Adem. Both of you comment on what comes out of this for us. I mean, what are the policy recommendations? What does it mean to know that income inequality between men and women is very different depending on the country you're in, the kind of economy that is in those countries? So what are we saying here? I mean, what's the next step for people to wrestle with in terms of how to address this? And Ceyhun, you want to go first, and then we'll go to Adem.
Sure. So first of all, I also want to emphasize, as an answer to the previous question, that we are working on different data sets here. So the one interesting aspect of our paper is that the two main variables that we are working with, which is the informal sector size and income inequality, they are by definition hard to measure, especially very hard to measure in a cross-country and large time series framework. But that is why we are using different data sets, both for inequality as well as for informal sector size, for robustness, to establish robustness of our results and obtain robust results with respect to the key findings of the paper. And for your second question, in terms of the policy recommendation that this paper might have, is that I strongly believe that this paper shows that female labor force participation rate, increasing female labor force participation rate, as well as reducing informality, are not substitutes to each other if you want to reduce income inequality. Instead, they are complements. So they can very well complement each other. That is, if a government is concerned with the level of income inequality in its economy, then two policy recommendations, for example, that might be coming out of the results of this paper is that it might design policies that can both at the same time increase female labor force participation as well as reduce informal sector size. For example, creating some tax incentives or social security incentives or subsidies for employers as well as for households that sort of might increase female labor force participation,
right,
as well as report these participation to the government properly so that they are formally registered.
Adem?
I would like to add maybe only one thing to Ceyhun's points. Yes, maybe we should look at the key barrier for women to join formal sector. They find informal sector more appealing because that suits to the nature of women. So they can make like the balance between household work and market work because they shoulder the large part of the household work. I mean, childcare or elderly care. I think the government policies in this context should focus on the provision of the social care because with such incentive, women will be able to prefer formal sector instead of informal sector. So I think that should be the key issue. And also regarding of income inequality, even we can add economic growth. Major research reports actually show that based on some policy simulations, if you create a job for women, rather than trying to create job in traditionally in male jobs, male-dominated sectors, the former is likely to create more jobs and higher economic growth, and which is also very related with income inequality and informalization. So as Ceyhun put it very nicely, yes, they don't conflict with each other. Trying to reduce the size of informal sector on the one hand, and also try to reduce income inequality and increase women's labor force participation.
It's been fascinating and important work. I appreciate the stuff you've done and for joining us here. Adem, Elveren, and Ceyhun, Elgin, thank you both so much for being with us here on The Real News. It's been a pleasure to talk with you both.
Thank you for having us.
And I'm Mark Steiner here for The Real News Network. Thank you all for joining us. Take care.